After the success of bantamweight and strawweight, the UFC added to its female roster with the women's featherweight division in 2017. But it was soon clear the new weight class would struggle to find the same level of legitimacy. Today, we look at the division's turbulent history in the octagon, a 6-year run of questionable signings, shocking upsets, and the unlikely name that led to its demise. Welcome to the INC, and this is the story of the UFC's worst weight class. The origins of women's featherweight began in March 2015, when women's MMA legend Cris Cyborg signed a multi-fight contract with the UFC. Cyborg had long been considered one of the most dominant fighters in the world, claiming titles in Strikeforce and Invicta, with her opponents having no answer for her brute strength and aggression, and holding the distinction of having never lost since her pro debut a decade earlier. Despite her achievements, Cyborg's signing took many by surprise, with the UFC having shown little interest in the featherweight division and a long-standing feud between herself and Dana White. But with Ronda Rousey pursuing ventures outside the cage, the company were forced to take a chance on the Brazilian brawler. Cyborg made her UFC debut the following year, making comfortable work of Leslie Smith and Lena Landsberg, but it didn't take long for cracks to appear between her and the promotion. Rather than compete at featherweight, Cyborg's early UFC bouts took place at 140-pound catchweight, with the company eventually planning to wean her down to 135. That was until September, when Cyborg appeared in an ESPN documentary chronicling the dangers of weight cutting. The shot of a visibly frail Cyborg went viral on social media, leading several state athletic commissions to announce they would no longer sanction fights for her at 140 pounds. Amid growing pressure from fans, governing bodies, and even Cyborg herself, the company were left with no choice but to introduce 145.
I think they don't want to open my division. And then if you then try make all the time at 140, 140, 140, maybe one day I can make 135.
The first women's featherweight bout took place in February 2017, with Germaine Durand taking on Holly Holm for the inaugural title. Durand would claim a competitive, albeit tepid bout by unanimous decision. The pivotal moment came when Durand rocked Holm after the bell, but was not penalized by the referee. All roads pointed to Durand defending her belt against Cyborg, only for the Dutch fighter to turn down the bout due to Cyborg's history of steroid use. Durand was stripped of her title a few months later, a moment that did little to help the legitimacy of the division. Cyborg, however, would compete for gold that July, taking on short-notice newcomer Tanya Evinger at UFC 214. Evinger surprised many by withstanding Cyborg's early onslaughts, but her opponent's power proved too much come the middle of the third round. The women's featherweight belt was finally in the hands of its rightful owner.
Cris Cyborg finally can add UFC champion to the ledger!
Cyborg quickly made up for lost time, claiming title defenses over Yana Kunitskaya and Holly Holm in the space of 3 months. A reported 450,000 buys for the Holm fight, proving the division had some mileage as a box office attraction. Over the next 12 months, the UFC gave the pretense of making featherweight a legitimate weight class. Season 28 of The Ultimate Fighter was dedicated to finding women to fill the division's roster, as did the signings of Invicta champions Megan Anderson and Felicia Spencer. The plans, however, quickly went awry. Bellator had preempted the UFC by introducing its own featherweight division the previous year, signing most of the sport's top 145ers, including inaugural champion Julia Budd. While the few fighters signed from The Ultimate Fighter moved to bantamweight shortly after the show's finale, the inaction started taking its toll on Cyborg. Prior to her third title defense, Cyborg called out the UFC for their failure to build a viable roster, going as far as to suggest Bellator's division was stronger than her own. UFC 232 would prove a pivotal night for women's featherweight, with the crowd boasting 2 division bouts for the first time in its history. Megan Anderson looked for her first company win against Kat Zingano, while Cyborg defended her title against bantamweight champion Amanda Nunes. Anderson's match with Zingano ended in bizarre fashion, as the grappling ace was forced out of the bout after Anderson's toe caught Zingano in her eye. The fight's climax shocked many that night at the Inglewood Forum. It was nothing compared to what happened next.
Oh, Nunes! She hurt her! Oh! She did it! Cris Cyborg out cold!
Nunes finished Cyborg just 51 seconds into the first round, ending the legend's 13-year winning streak and taking her title in the process. While all logic pointed towards a big money rematch, reportedly at a stadium show in Brazil, the UFC were unsold on the idea. Some accused Cyborg of asking for too much money to take the bout, while others suggested Dana White had repeatedly turned down calls for a rematch, residue from his previous beef with Cyborg before signing with the promotion. Cyborg instead returned to form with a dominant win over Felicia Spencer, but it proved to be her last fight for the UFC. Cyborg's contract expired immediately after the match, and with relations between her and White at an all-time low, the UFC announced they would not be matching contract rights for the fighter, with Cyborg announcing a move to Bellator a few weeks later. It left the UFC in an awkward position. The sole reason for 145 had left for pastures anew, while its champion had no interest in defending her belt. How would the UFC get fans to care about a division they themselves never wanted? The answer was simple. They didn't even try. It would take a global pandemic for the UFC to care about 145 again. Travel restrictions limited the amount of fighters available for the UFC's pay-per-view schedule, leading the UFC to coax Nunes into defending her belt against Felicia Spencer at UFC 250. Nunes did little to doubt her place as a substantial favorite, dominating the entirety of the bout but unable to finish the notoriously durable Canadian, being forced to settle for a one-sided decision. While the UFC tried putting Nunes on a pedestal, the public spoke with their wallets. At an estimated 80,000 pay-per-view buys, UFC 250 became the company's worst-drawing show of the modern era, breaking the record from UFC 224, also headlined by Nunes, which in turn previously broke her record from UFC 215. I am starting to notice a trend here. Lockdown provided an unlikely purpose for women's 145, as several bantamweight fighters chose to compete at the class rather than risk cutting weight in a pandemic. It led to an unwanted piece of MMA history as Macy Chasson fell 3 pounds short of the featherweight limit prior to her match with Raquel Pennington, in the process becoming the heaviest female fighter in UFC history, and with the featherweight division all but defunct, will likely never be beaten. Nunes meanwhile claimed another title defense against Megan Anderson at UFC 259, after which the company started to make their feelings known about the division. Despite being one of the few natural featherweights on the roster, Anderson was released from her contract a few days later, effectively forcing the fan-favorite Aussie into an early retirement. Anderson was joined on the sidelines by Aspen Ladd and Bea Malecki, two bantamweight fighters both known for their issues making weight, only to be released by the UFC after being told the company had no plans to incorporate them at 145. When the UFC did sign women's featherweights, they fell well below the company standard. Zara Fairn was a French kickboxer who hadn't competed in MMA for 2 years, but was still granted a UFC contract in 2019, losing all 4 of her bouts and being regarded as one of the company's worst fighters of recent years. Danielle Wolf didn't fare much better. The 38-year-old was signed through Dana White's Contender Series despite only having 1 pro fight. Wolf would fight just once over the next 4 years, losing a unanimous decision to Norma Dumont before quietly retiring from the sport. It was clear women's featherweight's sole purpose was as a trophy belt for Nunes, in a desperate attempt to get her over with the fans. The division, however, had one last white knight. Two-time Olympic champion Kayla Harrison transitioned to MMA in 2017, building up a 12-fight winning streak competing for the PFL. And with her contract expiring at the end of 2021, rumors began swirling she was UFC bound. Harrison was in attendance at UFC 269 as Nunes dropped back to 135 to face 8-1 underdog Juliana Pena, where a straightforward win would set the stage for the Harrison-Nunes super fight to save the division. Pena's upset win was the terminal blow for women's 145. Nunes' loss in such embarrassing fashion rendered her trophy belt redundant, as well as killing off any interest in a potential match with Harrison. While the UFC still made an attempt to sign Kayla, it fell well below her financial demands, with the fighter choosing to re-sign with the PFL for 2022. As Nunes turned her focus to regaining her bantamweight belt, women's featherweight was left to wander aimlessly, and soon even the division's OGs could see the writing on the wall. Felicia Spencer announced her retirement after a third-round stoppage of Leah Letson, who followed the popular Canadian out of the sport shortly after. By 2023, the division had gotten so bad, its fighters were even trying to get out of it mid-match.
And that's how Dumont slows things down. She hits
Rocked her running away.
The last women's featherweight bout took place in July 2023, with Norma Dumont claiming a unanimous decision over Chelsea Chandler. Appropriately, the fight saw Dumont break the record for the most wins in division history before committing her future to bantamweight in 2024. At the time of writing, women's featherweight finds itself in the same place it was a decade earlier, with Cyborg ruling the roost outside the UFC while the company tried to distance itself from the division. Women's 145 was doomed from the very start. Its creation was due to obligation rather than the best interest of the UFC, while the relationship between Cyborg and the promotion was strained at the best of times. The biggest mistake, however, was keeping the division around after Cyborg's departure, particularly when the promotion and the fighter it was kept to cater for saw no benefit in its existence. Bellator and the PFL have proven there is mileage in a serious 145 division. Let's just hope the UFC learns their lesson when the atomweights arrive in a few years' time.
She is driving a dump truck. My goodness.
Hey, I told you, she's a linebacker.
Driving a dump truck.
This is the INC. Please like, share, subscribe, post your comments below, and ring the bell so you never miss another video.